In this video, we're going to talk about training the triceps. And more specifically, we're going to talk about how each of the different heads of the triceps is actually slightly different from the others, and how, as a consequence, we can actually apply that to our training to train each of them more specifically if that's something that aligns with our goals. So first things first, we cover the long head of the triceps. The long head of the triceps is the only one of the three that has direct influence at the shoulder, right? So what you can see here on the right side of the screen, it's highlighted in gold. It actually attaches directly to the shoulder blade. So what that means is it will act slightly differently depending on the position of the shoulder, whereas the other heads aren't directly influenced by the shoulder position. And we'll get to what that actually means and how we can apply that in just a second here. Then we have the lateral head, which sits on the lateral side of the upper arm, again highlighted here in gold, which just crosses the elbow, meaning it just acts on the elbow. It doesn't change in its length when we move our shoulder in various positions as the long head might. And then lastly, we have the medial head, which sits underneath of the lateral head and the long head, which acts very similarly to the lateral head because, again, both the lateral head and the medial head are single joint tissues, which again means they just cross the elbow and act around the elbow, whereas the long head is the only one that is two joint, meaning that it has influence both at the shoulder and at the elbow. And again, we'll talk about practical application in just a second here, but what that really means in practice is when you move the shoulder around, the long head is going to be influenced directly, whether that means rotating it internally or externally, or in flexion and extension, or ab and adduction, right? Moving your shoulder all over the place will affect the long head, but not directly the lateral or the medial head. So let's talk about what that means. If I want to do exercises that are predominantly long head driven, what I want to do is make sure that my shoulder is fixed, right? Because if my shoulder is moving all over the place and I have an attachment site that is on the shoulder, I won't be able to create a ton of tension in that long head specifically, at least relative to other exercises. So what might that look like? Well, it might look like a traditional cable extension that looks something like this, where my arms are fixed at my sides. And why, again, would this be more of a long head thing as compared to the other heads? Well, it might be more of a long head thing because if we think about the architecture of two joint muscles, a big part of the function of two joint muscles is essentially to conserve energy. So what that means is if I can, contract this thing at a stable shoulder position, it can stabilize both the shoulder and it can move the elbow at the same time, meaning that it can do two jobs simultaneously. So my brain is going to save energy, it's going to conserve energy, and the way that it's going to do that is it's going to call to create a little bit more tension in that long head as opposed to the other two heads, which again just move the elbow. So a point I want to make very clear here is this does not mean that there is not tons of tension in the lateral and the medial heads. It just means that if your goal is to grow this thing most specifically and you want to make sure that at every possible chance you get, you're going to target this head, you want to make sure that your shoulder is in a stable, non-moving position like this video on the left. Now, because my arms are at my sides and my arm isn't over my head, as in this kind of an exercise, this represents more of a neutral or shortened position exercise for the long head, meaning that it doesn't have any additional length when my arms are at my sides. But when I go to put my arm overhead, as in this kind of an exercise here on the right that's playing now, I'm going to put actually more length into the long head, meaning that when I move my arm up and over my head, the origin, which again, I'm circling here with my mouse, and that insertion are going to move farther away from one another, which in essence just means that it's going to be a little bit more stretched and a little bit more lengthened. And if any of you have kept up or are familiar with the current research, the body of research on muscle lengths, you know that muscles in stretched positions have a higher capacity to produce force, at least just broad strokes. So whether my arm is over my head or whether my arm is at my side, and if I'm keeping it stable, these are going to be exercises that are heavily, heavily long head involved. Again, to repeat myself, does this mean that the lateral head and the medial head are not involved? The single joint guys? Absolutely not. They absolutely are. And just by necessity of their architecture and how they converge to a common tendon here, they all have to act if I'm bending or straightening my elbow against resistance, right? So it's important to keep that in mind. And it's important to really frame this discussion appropriately and contextualize it to say, okay, I have all three heads involved here whenever I'm doing a triceps extension, but the predominance will shift depending on the joint position, the load direction, and whether or not the joint position is changing. So again, takeaway for the long head stuff, keep the shoulder still, move the elbow, okay? That's the big takeaway here. Now, if I want to train more the lateral head or the medial head, which again is sort of underneath of these two, I'm going to want to do one of two categories of exercise. One category might be I'm moving my shoulder, right, in this triceps press type motion. Other variations that might do something similar to this are like dumbbell sort of press type motions, which are more like a tricep type thing, diamond push up type motions, dip type motions, right, where you have a lot of elbow motion, in addition to shoulder motion, right? So, what shoulder motion in this context might mean is you see how my upper arm in this position, if I sort of get my little marker here, starts in this position. And then if I play this video, it ends up in this position, right? So that's this many degrees of shoulder motion change in this particular exercise, which by necessity will recruit less of the long head, because think about it this way. If the long head were to act too much in this particular scenario because of where it actually attaches, it would actually almost antagonize the motion, meaning prevent the motion from happening to some degree, right? As my arm moves in front of my body, my long head is actually something that might prevent my arm from moving, again, because of its attachment at the shoulder and where it crosses the joint more specifically. So this is one category of exercise, which again, doesn't have to be this specific motion in particular. Again, it could be like something like a diamond push-up or a dip, or even some kind of barbell-oriented press, right, where your hands are fixed and your shoulders and your elbows are moving. Another category of exercise might be this extension where your arm is actually across your body. Now, I just said, okay, if your shoulder isn't moving, that's more of a long head thing. That's true unless, in this one particular exception, we are in an instance where our shoulder is highly internally rotated. Now, without getting too into the weeds, this is kind of what that internally rotated position might look like. All right, I'm just playing this clip over and over and over because it's a short clip. What that in essence means is that because we are in this high degree of internal rotation, and my long head is somewhat of an external rotator in this position, if my long head were to contract too much, it would actually prevent me from staying in this position. It would actually pull me out of this position. So the takeaway here is that the motions that are more single joint triceps involved are going to be motions where my shoulder is moving forward and backward, again, i.e. in this press, in the examples I listed earlier, or in a motion where I'm in an extreme position of internal rotation where my long head might actually counteract the position of this particular motion. And again, all of this is really just comes down to, okay, understanding the function of the anatomy and specifically how that anatomy changes with a changing joint position. So this particular extension, even though my shoulder is fixed, is really the only scenario in which I might actually advantage the single joint heads as opposed to the long head, again, specifically because I'm in this extreme position of internal rotation. So we can sort of lump the triceps training overall into two major categories. Long head dominated stuff where the shoulder is fixed at our side or over our head, right? And obviously, if you wanted to go somewhere in between those 2 points, if your shoulder were fixed, that is another example of what might sort of bias that long head a little bit more. And then the lateral and the medial, or the single joint heads, those exercises are going to be motions where the shoulder is moving or where we put the long head at a disadvantage, i.e. in that more internally rotated position. So overall, this is the summary. Again, it doesn't mean that in the long head motions, the other heads aren't active, or in the single joint motions that the long head isn't active. There's always an overlap and there's always a blend. And, if you're a beginner or if you're someone who's maybe new to these motions, all these motions will be plenty of stimulus, more than likely, if you're doing them with some degree of effort and some degree of volume, to stimulate growth in all three of the heads. But if you are maybe a more advanced trainee and you're looking for a way to maybe spice up your training and make it a little bit more specific and a little bit more calculated, so that maybe you can start to divide your volume into long head dominant stuff and medial and lateral head dominant stuff, that maybe it would be a good idea if you're having a tough time with elbow discomfort, right? Doing all these different kinds of motions within a week, maybe one day that's more long head dominant and then one day that's more single joint dominant, is a great way to sort of disperse stress over the course of a week so that you don't end up just repeating the same motion over and over and over again. There are tons of people who just do the same motions, and there's nothing inherently wrong with those motions, but at their extremes in terms of how much they're doing them, they may present with some issues just because of the sort of the repeated bout effect of stress and how that can influence force on the joints, medium to long term. So hopefully this was helpful and illuminating in some way. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, please subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. If you like this video and you want to learn more from me, please consider enrolling in my online anatomy and biomechanics course. The course contains over 15 hours specifically dedicated to improving your understanding of anatomy and physics and how it applies to lifting weights. Over 3,000 students have enrolled in this course and have reported back that it's the most easy to digest material that doesn't include any sort of boring textbook lecture that you might normally find in a typical college curriculum. So if you want to improve your ability to lift and as a consequence grow muscle more easily and reduce your pain in the gym, check out the link in the description.